Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are plunging into the really perplexing story of La Familia Michoacana. This was a Mexican drug cartel that, well, it presented a fascinating and often contradictory face to the world. The sources paint a picture of an organization that could be just brutally violent, deeply criminal, but at the same time claimed it was, a benevolent force protecting the people. So our mission today is to navigate these contradictions. We want to understand where they came from, how the cartel operated, what impact it had, and ultimately what its story tells us about the whole world of organized crime.
Yeah, and we've got a really rich set of sources here. They detail the cartel's origins, the key figures, their stated ideologies, also the wide range of their illegal activities, their run-ins with law enforcement, both sides of the border, and, how they eventually fragmented. It's quite a comprehensive look.
Definitely complex. Okay, let's unpack this then. The sources say La Familia Michoacana popped up in the early 1980s. La Piedad, Michoacan. Founded by a guy named Carlos Rosales Mendoza. But what immediately grabs you is the initial reason given for its existence. It's kind of striking, isn't it?
It really is.
How often these groups try to legitimize themselves with this sort of protection narrative.
Well, what's fascinating here is that initial story, according to Mexican analysts anyway, was that it was formed as like a vigilante group.
Right.
The stated goal, bring order to Michoacan, protect the poor. They positioned themselves against kidnappers and rival drug dealers who were, ironically, their main competition leader.
So a classic, we're the good guys fighting the other bad guys setup.
Exactly. And that strategy, presenting themselves as a solution, it can be pretty effective, at least at first, for getting local support. It lets them tap into real problems people have, creates a sense of dependency almost. But as we'll definitely see, the contradiction between that image and what they were actually doing, well, doesn't usually hold up long term.
Right, so this idea of protecting the vulnerable, that was the origin story. But it seems like very quickly, or maybe even right alongside that, they themselves got really deep into the criminal underworld. The sources are clear on the long list of activities.
Oh, absolutely. Despite that initial image, La Familia Michoacana got heavily involved in a huge array of crime. Drug trafficking, for sure. Big focus on methamphetamine, those clandestine labs in Michoacan. But it went way beyond that. People smuggling, money laundering, racketeering.
Which is basically demanding protection money. Right?
Yeah, demanding payments from businesses under threat. Extortion, too, using coercion for money or favors. Then kidnapping, murder, arms trafficking, assault, even counterfeiting. I mean, it was the full spectrum.
Wow. Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting for me. The sources talk about their early connection to a major player, the Gulf Cartel, specifically being part of Los Zetas back in the 90s. Sounds like they started out as muscle.
That's a crucial point. Yeah, back in the 90s, Los Zetas started as the Gulf Cartel's armed wing. They're enforcers, basically. And La Familia initially operated within that setup in Michoacan.
Okay.
Their main goal then with the alliance was getting control of the drug trade in Michoacan, pushing out rivals.
But that didn't stick.
No, that relationship didn't last. In 2006, they splintered off, went independent as their own drug trafficking operation.
And this split, it seems like it happened around the time some really pivotal and maybe kind of eccentric leaders rose up.
Definitely.
The sources highlight a few key figures, and their ideologies seem quite distinct.
Oh, absolutely. After the founder, Carlos Rosales Mendoza, the leadership really centered around Nazario Moreno Gonzalez. His nickname was El Más Loco, the craziest one.
Tells you somewhere there.
Right. He preached this idea of a, quote, divine right to eliminate enemies. And he even carried around his own collection of sayings, almost like a personal Bible. And paradoxically insisted his own members abstain from the drugs they were making and selling.
That is wild. Abstinence while being a major meth producer.
Okay. Crazy contradiction, yeah.
And the sources also mention his key partners. Guys who are also vying for control. Big bounties on him.
Yes, his partners included José de Jesus Méndez Vargas, Servando Gómez Martinez, and Enrique Plancarte Solis. All three had a $2 million U.S. bounty for their capture, shows how important they were.
Right.
After Moreno was allegedly killed in 2010, though there's confusion about that later, José de Jesus Méndez Vargas, known as El Chango Méndez, tried to take control. But his authority was quickly challenged by Gómez Martinez and Plancarte Solis.
And they went on to form.
They formed that notorious splinter group, the Knights Templar.
Okay, the Knights Templar. We'll definitely come back to them. But let's dig into this quasi-religious thing more, because it's such a weird recurring theme with La Familia. It wasn't just about the money, was it? This mix of extreme violence and, like, religious ideology. It's very unusual.
It really is.
Does it suggest something deeper? Like needing control beyond just cash? Maybe wanting loyalty or purpose among the members?
Well, what's fascinating is how overt it was. The religious rhetoric, the symbols.
Hmm.
Moreno Gonzalez and Mendez Vargas explicitly called their violence assassinations beheadings acts of divine justice.
Divine justice.
Yeah.
Huh.
And Moreno, like we said, published his own Bible. One source says it mixed evangelical-style self-help with, like, peasant slogans. Plus, he made John Eldridge's book Wild at Heart, which is about masculine spirituality required reading for members.
Required reading. Like homework?
Apparently, even paid teachers to circulate it.
That's bizarre.
It really suggests an attempt to create this powerful, almost cult-like devotion in the ranks, maybe to ensure obedience, willingness to commit extreme violence, all under this banner of a higher purpose.
So they were actively trying to shape their members' ideology, like a cult, as you said.
Right.
And it wasn't just internal messaging, right? They pushed this image out to the community, too.
Exactly. They used religion and family values in their recruitment pitches. They'd even put up banners claiming they didn't tolerate substance abuse or exploiting women and children. There are reports of them giving loans to communities, farmers, businesses, schools, churches, and they even advertised their supposed good deeds in local newspapers, trying to build social support.
But the gap between that image they built and what they actually did, it's just staggering. The sources detail some truly horrific violence that just blows any claim of benevolence out of the water.
And this really makes you question the real motives behind the messaging, doesn't it? Despite claiming to protect people, wanting peace, they even offered to retreat and disband multiple times if the government met conditions.
Which the government refused.
Right, refused. But despite all that talk, La Familia engaged in extreme violence. That 2006 European nightclub incident is maybe the most infamous example, leaving severed heads with a message claiming divine justice against people who deserve to die.
Just horrific.
It starkly shows the brutal reality behind that facade.
So, okay, how did they actually operate day to day? Main income sources, how did they control things?
Their methods were pretty sophisticated, and they evolved. They heavily used the port of Lázaro Cárdenas for importing narcotics, likely from South America.
Key port.
Very key. And they had significant meth production labs up in the Sierra Madre Highlands. Over time, they really transitioned into what one source calls a parallel state in Michoacán, meaning they weren't just drug traffickers, they were extorting businesses for taxes. They were funding community projects to curry favor, controlling petty crime in their areas, even settling local disputes.
Wow, so they were trying to basically replace the government functions in some places?
It sounds like it, yeah, filling a vacuum.
And their reach wasn't just Mexico, right? Sources say they had a U.S. presence, too.
That's right. La Familia expanded into the U.S. They were involved in distributing various drugs. Notably, they operated these super labs for large-scale meth production.
Super labs in the U.S.
Yeah. And ironically, some sources suggest they claim they were against selling drugs to Mexicans.
Another contradiction.
Exactly. Their other U.S. activities included selling unlicensed DVDs, people smuggling, and even this really brutal debt-collecting service that involved kidnapping people who owed money.
Jeez. Okay, and cartel influence often seeps into politics? Law enforcement? La Familia was no exception.
Seems almost inevitable, doesn't it, for groups this powerful? The sources say they backed candidates they liked, financed campaigns, even forced other candidates to drop out.
Wow.
They also reportedly bribed local politicians, even had influence over naming police chiefs.
Seriously. Naming police chiefs.
That's what's reported. And this level of corruption led to arrests, mayors, other local officials suspected of being linked to the cartel.
Unsurprising, then, that they drew major heat from law enforcement on both sides of the border.
Oh, yeah. There were some significant operations targeting them.
Tell us about those.
Well, a big one was the 2009 arrest of Arnaldo Rueda Medina, El Cede. He was basically second in command and apparently responsible for the religious indoctrination side of things.
The ideology guy.
Right. And his arrest triggered these incredibly violent retaliations against federal police. Tragically, that included the torture and murder of 12 federal police agents later in 2009, left with a threatening message.
That kind of brazen attack on federal agents, it just shows their power and ruthlessness at the time.
Absolutely. And the U.S. authorities also launched major efforts.
Like Project Coronado?
Exactly. Project Coronado in 2009. It was this huge 4-year U.S. investigation, resulted in over 300 arrests across 19 states. seized massive amounts of cocaine, meth, marijuana, weapons, millions in cash.
Of a major dent.
A huge operation. Overall, that project led to over 11,186 arrests and $33 million seized, according to the sources. Then, in 2011, there was Project Delirium, more arrests in the U.S. and internationally, more large seizures. And the capture of José de Jesus Mendez Vargas in Mexico in 2011, that was another big blow.
So a lot of pressure building.
Yeah.
And like any of these groups, they had allies and enemies, right? A complex web.
Definitely. The landscape is always shifting. Their allies reportedly included the Sinaloa Cartel at times, La Nueva Familia Michoacana, Los Viagras, even groups like Mara Salvatrucha.
Okay.
Rivals included their own splinter group, the Knights Templar, obviously, plus Los Zetas, who they originally split from, La Union Tepito, others. These rivalries just fueled more violence.
And ultimately, despite how strong they were, La Familia seems to have fractured and declined quite a bit. What caused that?
The alleged death of Nazario Moreno Gonzalez in 2010 seems to be the main catalyst for the big split.
Right, the leader.
Yeah. As we mentioned, that led Plancarte and Gomez to form the Knights Templar, creating this intense internal rivalry. Mendez Vargas tried to keep La Familia going, but by 2011, Mexican authorities were already claiming the cartel was exterminated.
Which probably wasn't entirely true.
No, clearly they continued to operate in some form, but their power was definitely weakened. By 2020, sources indicate splinter groups dominated Guerrero, and in Michoacan itself, other groups like Cartel del Abuelo and Los Viagras were more prominent. Suggests La Familia's influence had really faded.
Before we wrap up, there was that interesting note about a connection to the U.S. via the I-75 corridor.
Yeah, that was interesting. La Familia reportedly had links to a drug trafficking group in Atlanta, the Flores Camargo Cartel. This group allegedly moved marijuana and cocaine up the I-75 corridor all the way to Detroit.
Wow, that highlights their logistical reach deep into the U.S., supplying other networks.
Exactly.
And finally, just to close the loop, that early leader, Arnoldo Rueda Medina, he was eventually extradited and sentenced in the U.S.
That's right. Rueda Medina, El Ceda, arrested way back in 2009 in Mexico. He was extradited to the U.S. in 2017 and then sentenced to a long prison term in 2018 on drug trafficking charges.
So some measure of justice there years later.
A significant legal consequence for a key figure, yes.
Okay, so bringing it all together, it's this incredibly complex, contradictory picture, isn't it? La Familia Michoacana started with maybe benevolent claims, descended into brutal violence, wrapped itself in religion, and then fragmented.
It really is. You can see La Familia presents a really complex case study. It wasn't just about drugs. It was about power, identity, this really distorted sense of purpose.
Yeah.
And that attempt to blend religious ideology with extreme cartel violence,
Yeah.
it just created this particularly disturbing and frankly fascinating dynamic.
It really forces you to question the simple label criminal enterprise. The mix of violence, ideology, even those attempts at social governance shows something much more intricate going on.
Absolutely. It raises important questions about power and legitimacy, even in the criminal underworld. You know, how do these groups try to justify what they do? How do they try to get support? And what are the long-term effects of those strategies?
Yeah, what really stands out is how they tried to cultivate that social base. Offering help with one hand, inflicting terror with the other, makes you wonder about all the different strategies these organizations use to get and keep control.
It really does. And the long-term consequences, you know.
Yeah.
Does that mix ever truly work?
Right. Well, if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, you might find it interesting to look into the rise and fall of other cartels. Or maybe the role ideology plays more broadly in criminal groups.
Yeah, or researching the impact of groups like the Knights Templar, the ones who splintered off La Familia, that could provide more insight too.
Definitely.
And considering La Familia's attempts to act like a parallel state, it really raises a fundamental question. What about the relationship between organized crime, governance, and just the social fabric of a place? What happens when those lines get blurred?
A really crucial and maybe unsettling question to end on. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.